under two hashtags, that is Charter Africa and DG Trends. So I encourage you all who have Twitter handles and social media handles to participate in that aspect of the dialogue by tweeting some of your thoughts and ideas, and also some of the reflections from what we will hear today. We also have interpretation channels that are available from English to French and French to English. If you look at the bottom left corner, you will see an icon that looks like a globe, and it's from there that you can then be able to click and get the interpretation that you require. So with regards to the forum that we are having, it is inspired by the fact that democratic governance is essentially a key ingredient or fulcrum to the sustainable development that is aspired to within the African Union's Agenda 2063. And some of the key elements of democratic governance do include the avenues for effective public participation that should enable the citizenry to influence and inform policy-making processes. It is also a key element of responsive political leadership, where decisions and actions are transparent and accountable to the public in whose interests our political leaders serve. And it is also about the adherence to the rule of law and the promotion and protection of human rights, as is embodied within the African Charter on Human and People's Rights and the wider principles of the Constitutive Act of the African Union. Now, these ingredients have also been within the African Charter on Democracy, Elections, and Governance. And since its adoption in 2007, we've had different levels of successes and setbacks within the arena of democratic governance. We have seen the ending of protracted cycles of conflict. We've seen the ushering in of democratic transitions after periods of authoritarianism. But then also recently, we have unfortunately seen the regression into unconstitutional changes of government. We have seen highly disputed electoral outcomes, and also very delicate transitions that have needed to be managed with regards to very elaborate peace processes. And it's in that context that we need to take stock of what it means, therefore, to have had this instrument on democratic governance for the last 15 years. Hopefully, we will be able to take stock of the overall picture of the instrument's adoption and enforcement at the national level and continental level. We should be able to then share experiences as stakeholders with regards to how to improve the rate of effective implementation of the principles enshrined within that instrument, and that hopefully we can identify some of the gaps and challenges that have existed during this 15-year period, and that they can then inform a clear-cut agenda for more robust enforcement going forward. And we hope to do this through a series of conversations. We have an esteemed list of speakers and panels from the African Union and from civil society. And it is that I will now turn to without much further ado, by first welcoming remarks by the head of the African Governance Architecture Secretariat, Mr. Ambassador Salah Hamad. So without further ado, Ambassador Salah Hamad, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, program moderator, my dear brother Andrew. And through you, I wish to thank all the participants for being part of this very important engagement on the ACDEG 15 years down the road. And I'm quite honored to see many familiar faces and names on the screen. And this is, of course, an indication that how important this charter is to many of us, if not to all of us, of course, around the table today. But the reason that is bringing us together is not only to commemorate the 15th anniversary, which happened on the 30th of January, 2022, since the adoption of the charter was the 30th of January of 2007. with the entry into force in February 2012. But the reason is, of course, because we're changes of government in many, particularly West African region. And the question will be what is really the whether the charter is an effective tool in promoting democracy and good governance in Africa. Of course, from the African Union point of view, that we believe the African Charter is extremely important instrument that is needed to be promoted for universal ratification and also for implementation and domestication at the national level. And that is why we are very happy with the partnership with the Charter Project and with many other civil society initiatives to promote and to advocate and lobby for the universal ratification of the ACDEG at the national level. We have been working very closely with many of our partners, internal partners and external partners, to promote this important treaty at the national level. As a result, we have over 85 ratifications so far, from a total of 55 member states, 42 signatures that are on record. But we still believe that the way is long, and the journey is going to be a bit longer than expected and anticipated, simply because the provisions of the Charter needed to be integrated into the civic education. So from the 35 and that leaves behind a good number of member states with reports that are due to be submitted but yet to be submitted. And the question is why member states are not responding or not really submitting reports, because many member states, they are still lacking behind in the implementation and domestication of the provision of the Charter at the national level. And through the efforts that we made as a Secretariat of the AGA-ABSA, we found out that many member states, in fact, they either lack the political support to implement, domesticate, or they lack the capacity, whether it is financial, technical, or human resource capacity, to move ahead with the implementation and domestication of the ACDEG at the national level. We also witnessed that in many cases, many officials in many African countries are not really aware of the existence of this ACDEG, although their own countries are ratifying parties or ratifying countries to the treaty. And that really put us in a way for more to be done in terms of awareness raising on the existence of this very important instruments, especially among officials, government officials, in particular parliamentarians, and other members of the government entities and sectors. So as you can see, there is really more to be done, and that is what we really count as the African Charter, but also to assist in the domestication.
Is your connection okay?
And implementation process, and to also assist later on in the reporting process.
Yes, sir.
Of the on the African ACDEG as well. Excuse me. I also want to add that to add to the challenge that are currently facing, the Charter, which is of course an African Union instrument or treaty that has been adopted at the level of our heads of state and government, and which was immediately signed by a good number of member states, remain to be something that is looked at as a suspicious, with a suspicious look, I would say, simply because many member states, in fact, fail to understand the real provisions or the real meaning of the interpretation of the provisions of the African Charter on Democracy, Elections, and Governance. Now, to solve these issues, I think the only way to go is to really involve collectively all the stakeholders in this process. And when I say stakeholders, I mean civil society, media, academia, in addition to officials from the government, to one, advocate for ratification, domestication, and implementation, but also to raise awareness about the importance of this very important treaty. With that, we will be able to move ahead in the direction that was set for this treaty to take, and, and then the purpose of the implementation of this treaty will be more clearer. Now, with the unconstitutional changes of governments in many parts of Africa, I think we have a very good reason to examine the past 15 years and to see where we are today, and then to decide on the way forward. And that is why this meeting is timely. This meeting is extremely important in that regard, because it will certainly assist us in the African Union to evaluate and examine the previous 15 years and to decide on the way forward. But of course, the way forward is very clear, that we really need to join efforts with all the stakeholders that are there to support the African Union with the ratification of this very important treaty and the implementation and domestication. But also, I think there's another important element as part of the citizen engagement strategy of the African Union, and that is how to make the African Union own this treaty and make it part of their own of their governance awareness system. Because without the involvement of the African citizens and without the ownership of the African citizens of this very important treaty, the treaty will remain a document that will be shelved and will be forgotten and will be covered with dust. So therefore, we need to really think of how we can engage the African citizens in owning this treaty and also in advancing the cause of promoting this treaty for universal ratification. The other issue that I would like to really bring to the table today, and hopefully it will be enriched through discussions and debates, the involvement, particularly the involvement of civil society and academia and media. We have not really been able to attract the media, the African media, I would say, to speak and to popularize the ACDEG. And I hope today Andrew and his colleagues were able to invite a number of African media outlets to be part of this discussion. We need to really bring them to the table. We need them to really be part of this process, because the media is extremely important, whether it is social media or the traditional media, in promoting the ACDEG. Civil society involvement, we have been really in partnership with many civil society organizations, but in many cases, these civil societies are seen as the others, those who are not really supportive of the governments that we have in Africa. So I think there's a gap, and we really need to think of how we can bridge that gap so the civil society could have a bigger role and also an important role in the advocacy and ratification of this important treaty. Third, the issue of the lack of awareness within the government officials. How can we really deal with this matter? How can we make the treaty well known to the African governance officials? How can we ensure continuity of this awareness, whether these officials are in office or not? So these are issues that we really need to think about and to be discussed. So at least the African Union will have clearer support from you on how to proceed. Of course, the involvement of the African Union organs and institutions, as well as the involvement of REX, the regional economic communities, is also very, very crucial. And maybe here through the platform, the African Governance Platform, which is the arm of the African governance architecture, more efforts could be in place to enrich this partnership between the African Union family as well as the regional economic communities. Another venue that I could also mention today is the PRC Subcommittee on Human Rights, Democracy and Governance, which is the PRC arm on promoting human rights, democracy, rule of law, and constitutionalism in Africa. And I think with the involvement of members of the PRC Subcommittee in promotional visits, in advocacy visits, that could also be another way to promote the universal ratification of this very important treaty. Let me conclude by saying that we are quite hopeful as African Governance Architecture Secretariat, African Governance Architecture and African Peace and Security Architecture Secretariat, AGA-APSA. We are quite hopeful that with the support we are getting from our partners, with the involvement of civil society, academia, and media, the enhanced relationship between the African Union organs and the African Union Commission, as well as the RECs, with all of these efforts collectively, we will be able to get there, to reach the universal ratification that we are hoping for as soon as possible. But of course, the second part of the story will be how to assist our member states with the domestication and implementation at the national level before we move to the last stage of the process, which is the reporting process on the ACDEG. With these few remarks and ideas and thoughts, I wish to once again thank the organizers, the Charter Project, and colleagues from everywhere in Africa around the table today for availing yourself to be part of this very important discussion. Once again, thank you, and we look forward to fruitful deliberations today. All the best of wishes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Salah, for starting us off with those very insightful remarks. I will not pretend to try and summarize all the key points that you have highlighted. Safe to say that there is a lot of food for thought for us to take with us in the rest of the discussions with regards to enlivening the aspect of citizenship engagement with the African Union organs, harnessing the potential of key allyships with civil society and the media, looking to also structure and support and ensure that there is strong engagement with the AGA-APSA framework, because it presents a very strong opportunity for strategic coherence, not just within the African Union organs on this issue of democratic governance, but also with the stakeholders they engage with, being the citizenry and civil society. I must also say that in my excitement to kickstart this discussion, I did overlook one aspect of the agenda and that I should apologize for and now remedy. We should also have some welcome remarks from the European Union delegation representative, Mr. Alban Biosat, and I will now take this opportunity to invite him to make his welcoming remarks with the apology for my oversight. Over to you, Alban.
Thank you. Thank you, Andrew. No problem at all. Good afternoon, colleagues, partners, everyone, participants. Thanks for giving me the floor on behalf of the delegation to the AU, indeed, which is a close partner to the African governance architecture and its various organs, and clearly a keen supporter of ACDEG. So I'm here basically intervening also because the EU funds this charter project via its AGA support. Well, we're very much welcome this initiative to celebrate the charter today to mark its double anniversary, which with its 35 countries that have ratified it, and as was said, 42 who are about to do so. It's one of the norms or instruments of the EU that seems to be perhaps the one that is most spread and informs national policy, though of course another 20 countries are missing. ACDEG quote basically is the set of broad objectives that heads of states have agreed to pursue and be held accountable for. So now ensuring compliance to this normative framework requires efforts at continental level, but also at national and of course also regional level, which implies some sort of better coordination and finding complementarities in advocacy and monitoring activities by the relevant AU organs, and notably APRM, which has been mandated to do so. To engage with signatory states and others, but also non-state actors. So here we're talking civil society, but indeed, as was said, also media, the variety of media actors, also political actors, labor unions, private sector associations, and the rest. That calls for mutual understanding among actors and for developing some sort of multi-level strategy so that the appropriate stakeholders can mobilize at each level. And for that to happen, it's about supporting or strengthening their capacity and opening up spaces for dialogue. There's quite a few already, some more or less structured, linked to specific institutions or regular events, including between the AU and the EU. I take also this opportunity because this informs the dialogue we're having today to echo a growing concern that is shared among the worrying resurgence of coup, so-called unconstitutional changes of government that seem to call for actively re-engaging the debate on the implication of for democracy in political transitions, but also on how to expand the role of citizens in decision making to precisely perhaps reverse this trend. And on that matter, I think you and I, we noticed and we saw images of outspoken support among groups of citizens in those countries, and sometimes youth groups, in favor of coup plotters or claiming, apparent rejection of elected authorities. That tells us perhaps that there might be more to these changes that we normally assume about the role of, for instance, political corruption and the widening distance between the political class and the population in feeding that rejection of democratic governance values and systems. What is interesting from where I stand is also that I believe this is a trend that is at play elsewhere beyond Africa. It affects a number of our countries in Europe where we are witnessing a rise in populist appeals. And that leads us, I guess, or should lead us to seek new ways to encourage emerging initiatives aimed at regenerating democratic practices in order to foster more inclusive and participatory and therefore transformative systems of governance. This need for involving for the involvement of all informs many of the activities and projects that we at the EU delegations have been designing and supporting, and notably this charter project, which focuses on youth engagement via innovative approaches and tools, notably digital, and in short, basically supporting civic tech in Africa. And there I want to stress another issue, which I think perhaps will be something for us to discuss today, is that ACDEG does not account for those challenges associated with the consumption and usage of digital technology. It was developed before that became like a major point on the agenda. And these are areas for the AU Commission and other AGA organs to perhaps engage more actively and notably apprehend in electoral contexts. So it could be debated actually whether ACDEG deserves to be revisited or updated, or if it's a better strategy to do with what exists, yet trying to address the digital related challenges in parallel. To finish, well, I want to stress that the EU is, supporting all sorts of activities related to the ACDEG agenda. We have 25 million AGA support project that funds directly 5 AGA organs via direct contributions and technical assistance, including, we also have direct contribution to the AU Commission that includes PAPS. We have APSA support projects, and we have a number of new ones which are in the pipes, including elections and transitional justice, but also we're looking at how to launch interventions in support of civil society and notably the media. It was said it's a key actor that so far we not failed, but we should engage with more. I leave the floor here to my esteemed colleagues and interlocutors of the AU, whose, I guess, contribution clearly demonstrates today, just like us, that we have a shared interest in building more bridges with civil society. So that policy matters, institutional matters do effectively mean something for citizens. And I'm keen to carefully listen to the rest of the discussion today. And that's it for me. I thank you very much and for your interest and initiative. Thank you, Andrew, back to you.
Thank you very much, Albon, for those insightful and very necessary remarks. More food for thought from your presentation as well. I am hoping that maybe we can also just flag this for ourselves, and I encourage the participants to also begin reflecting on some of these issues, and perhaps even providing some insight or some perspectives by way of the chat box or even on social media on Twitter. Key elements again, I think the key question you've put out for us to think about is, are we embracing sufficient innovation as we talk about the implementation of this instrument and the promotion of democratic governance more generally, and particularly with regards to that innovation? Is the ACDEG alive to our digital realities of today? And if not, then how can we enrich the implementation of the instrument to reflect these digital realities? So that goes again hand in hand with what we had already had earlier about the importance of enlivening citizen engagement with regards to the issue of democratic governance, and also strengthening collaborations with different stakeholders who can elevate the platforms we use to drive the agenda of citizen ownership around this very key issue. And maybe it's in relation to that that we would then be very grateful to hear from the representative from the Economic, Social and Cultural Council, ECOSOC, if we have him on the line. And that would be Mr. Emmanuel Abdullahi, who heads the Civil and Political Rights Cluster. Do we have Mr. Emmanuel Abdullahi with us?
I don't think he has joined, unfortunately.
Okay, unfortunately, then we will probably have to move on with the program to also then hear from the other very essential African Union organ that helps us move forward with the aspect of tracking the elements of, or the state of governance on the continent more broadly, and that is the African peer review mechanism. To provide remarks on behalf of the APRM is Mr. Batloka Makom, the acting chief of staff within the APRM, who I believe is with us. And so without further ado, I would grant him the floor to make his remarks.
Thank you very much, my dear good brother Andrew, and all protocol observed. On behalf of your good friend, Professor Dimaloka, I would like to state that this very meeting that we are having today, organized by many organizations, and in particular the Charter Project, is a clear crystallization of the sacrosanct principles of the AU, in particular, the participation of the African peoples in the activities of the Union. And that principle, I think, is clearly articulated in Article 4C of the Constitutive Act of our Union. So we are very proud that we have organized this meeting, and as organs of the AU, we are always at your disposal to engage with us and to tell you what we are doing as far as the promotion of the values and principles and objectives of our Union. Your Excellencies, we cannot talk about ACDEG without talking about the Algiers Declaration on Unconstitutional Changes of Government that was adopted in Algiers in 1999. Also, we cannot talk about ACDEG without talking about the Lomé Declaration on OAU's response to unconstitutional changes of government on the continent. We are very pleased, Your Excellencies, that this meeting that we're having today comes on the year that our Union is celebrating 20th anniversary of the operationalization of the AU. We are celebrating 20 years of the operationalization of the AU this year, and it's also 1 year before we celebrate the 60th anniversary of the establishment of our continental organization. So it is indeed our great pleasure to participate at this meeting, where will be reflecting on the adoption and implementation of ACDEG. To date, amongst the 55 AU member states, 35 have ratified the Charter, and 42 of those member states, of the 55 member states, have acceded to the APRM as participating member states to the APRM. This is a reflection of the commitment of the AU member states to good governance, popular participation, the rule of law, and human rights. Your Excellencies, the APRM has been mandated in terms of Article 6(1)(I) of the APRM statute to encourage participating states to implement ACDEG. And Article 6(1)(H) is the operationalization of the principles and objectives of the Union, namely the promotion of democratic principles and institutions, popular participation, and good governance, as articulated in Article 3G and Article 3H of the AU's Constitutive Act, and most importantly, Article 4P of the Constitutive Act that talks about condemnation and rejection of unconstitutional changes of government on the continent. The 15th anniversary of the adoption of ACDEG and 10th anniversary of the entry of force of ACDEG has come at an opportune time in the history of Africa, as we are witnessing the resurgence of unconstitutional changes of government on the continent. Colleagues, as you are aware, ACDEG is a framework adopted by our heads of state and government to improve governance on the continent. The mechanism, the APRM as a mechanism, is a self-monitoring tool through which governance is assessed and countries are reviewed, and also the review process is at the highest level of heads of state and government. And the values and principles that are contained in ACDEG are part and parcel of our review process at the level of heads of state and government of our mechanism. Indeed, allow me to reinforce that APRM as an effective tool in assessing instruments such as ACDEG pursues, it does this through a questionnaire that has 5 thematic areas of focus. And those 5 thematic areas of focus are democratic and political governance, economic governance and management, corporate governance, and socio-economic development. And the last one is state resilience. This instrument, the questionnaire, was designed with the principles of ACDEG in mind, especially the democratic and political governance aspect. The questionnaire contributes to assessing the status of the rule of law, peace and security, and the development in a country, as well as developing the recommendations. Also in promoting and strengthening the consolidation of institutions for good governance, continental unity and solidarity. Your Excellencies, despite notable progress that have been achieved and efforts invested, mechanisms in place to promote good governance, the continent is faced with governance deficits such as the growing insecurity, youth unemployment, poor service delivery, corruption, and amongst others. And these factors are the ones that trigger popular presence, mass protest, and unconstitutional changes of government. As we take stock of progress of the last 15 years and the last 10 years, it is critical for us to reflect on the gaps and challenges to signing, ratifying, and implementing the provisions of the Charter in light of the recurring unconstitutional changes of government on the continent. While doing so, as the keepers of good governance, democracy, peace, and security on the continent, we must also identify the durable solutions by working together hand in hand. This will require all of us to take advantage of the forums such as this one we are having today, where we'll be sharing experiences and also identifying areas of collaboration. Colleagues, as the APRM, we have been given a mandate by the AU Assembly to assess the state of governance in Africa through the Africa Governance Report that we are supposed to present to the Assembly every 2 years. For the third edition of the report, which will be presented to the Assembly in February 2023 and thereafter published, the APRM, in collaboration with AGA platform members, is currently working on assessing the drivers of unconstitutional changes of government with a critical analysis of the existing legal and policy frameworks in place. As the AGA platform members, we will be providing recommendations on strengthening the existing frameworks such as ACDEG and policies of the Union, regional economic communities, think tanks, and research institutions. As I conclude, allow me, Your Excellencies, to thank the organizers of this very important meeting, and we look forward to the discussion with the hope of building further collaborations and understanding, and most importantly, creating new opportunities to respect it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very insightful remarks, and also bringing out potential action areas of where we could go to next with regards of our engagement on this issue and collaboration. But before I proceed, I would just want to highlight as a rule of procedure that kindly, if you do not have the floor, please mute your microphone so that we will be able to hear the person on the floor very clearly. But then turning again to the remarks and the role of the critical role that the African peer review mechanism plays on the issue of the implementation of the African Charter of Democracy, Elections and Governance, I think from the remarks we've just had, we can already see very clear opening points for engagement, especially with regards to the levels of state engagement and state review by way of the questionnaire around the very key themes of political governance and state resilience, but then also the highlight of the fact that the next African governance report will actually look to the issue of unconstitutional changes of government. And already from my vantage point, I would be eager to follow up with exploring how, as civil society organizations, as think tanks, as stakeholders, we can lend our efforts and our input to informing the development of that report and this particular important theme. But moving on, I will now also grant the floor to yet another important and essential African Union organ. And we did hear in Ambassador Salah's remarks the importance of enlisting parliaments in the effort to domesticate and enforce the principles of the African Charter on Democracy, Elections and Governance. And we do have our continental parliamentary institution, that is the Pan-African Parliament, represented today in the form of the acting clerk to the Pan-African Parliament, Mr. Gali Masaharu. And so without further ado, I will grant him the floor to give us some of his perspectives on what we should be taking stock of with regards to the Charter and how we can move forward. Mr. Haru, the floor is yours.
Merci, Monsieur le Président de séance. Avant d'introduire mon propos, permettez-moi de m'acquitter de ce devoir de vous remercier pour nous avoir invités à cette réunion combien importante en tant que Parlement panafricain. Et dire que nous répondons présents à ce rendez-vous conformément à la vocation normative et à l'orientation stratégique du Parlement panafricain qui l'oblige à promouvoir et à participer à des plateformes qui peuvent faciliter l'intégration et la prise de décision, la prise en compte des voix des peuples africains et de la diaspora africaine dans l'élaboration des politiques de l'Union africaine et la mise en œuvre des valeurs partagées telles que les droits de l'homme, l'état de droit, la démocratie, la bonne gouvernance sur le continent africain. Mesdames et messieurs, distingués invités, en tant qu'organe parlementaire de l'Union africaine, le Parlement panafricain a pour mandat de veiller à ce que les peuples d'Afrique et sa diaspora participent de manière significative aux discussions et à la prise des décisions sur les questions et les défis qui affectent le continent. Investi actuellement du pouvoir consultatif, le Parlement panafricain devrait, lorsque son protocole, dit protocole de Malabo, enregistrera les ratifications requises, devenir un Parlement doté de pleins pouvoirs législatifs. Cela permettra, entre autres, d'adopter et de proposer des lois types susceptibles de faire avancer et de promouvoir la mise en œuvre des instruments normatifs et des politiques de l'Union africaine, dont la Charte africaine de la démocratie, des élections et de la gouvernance, dont nous commémorons non seulement les 15 ans d'existence, mais aussi la décennie de son entrée en vigueur. 15 et 10 ans constituent une fourchette de temps plus ou moins raisonnable pour évaluer non seulement l'impact et la pertinence de cet instrument, mais aussi les défis et les opportunités relatives à sa mise en œuvre. Chers participants, je voudrais dire qu'un bilan lucide et objectif de l'évolution de la démocratie dans l'espace africain permet de noter avec beaucoup d'espoir quand même que les avancées en matière démocratique dans plusieurs pays laissent une lueur d'espoir. Toutefois, force est de constater que malheureusement, le continent reste un des continents où la démocratie avance moins vite comparé aux autres continents. Les 5 premières années, ces 5 dernières années, la démocratie a enregistré regrettablement des reculs dans les différentes régions d'Afrique, avec l'émergence des formes anticonstitutionnelles, des prises de pouvoir et la recrudescence des groupes terroristes dans beaucoup de zones d'Afrique, lesquels phénomènes sont la résultante, soit directe ou indirecte, d'un déficit de culture démocratique, de gouvernance et des droits humains. Il faut noter que une décennie après l'entrée en vigueur de la Charte africaine de la démocratie, des élections de la gouvernance, d'une part, et d'autre part, 60 ans après les indépendances africaines, cette tendance mérite d'être renversée. Et il appartient à tous les Africains de s'approprier cette lourde et exaltante tâche qui consiste à débarrasser l'Afrique des démons de guerre civile, des terroristes, des pratiques de mauvaise gouvernance, des coups d'État, tels qu'on l'observe présentement, et qui participent à saper tout espoir de développement de nos pays. Telle a été la vision d'ailleurs de l'Union africaine, dont l'aspiration profonde a amené les chefs d'État et de gouvernement à adopter en janvier 2007 la Charte africaine de la démocratie, des élections et de la gouvernance, cet instrument qui consacre des pratiques consensuelles et des règles communes à l'approfondissement et à la consolidation de la démocratie, de l'état des droits, de la paix, de la sécurité, de la bonne gouvernance et du développement dont l'Afrique a besoin. Ainsi donc, il ne serait pas tendancieux de s'interroger sur la pertinence de cet instrument juridique face à l'émergence de nouvelles formes de changements anticonstitutionnels de pouvoir, notamment les coups d'État, qui sont parfois baptisés à tort ou à raison des révolutions populaires. Il en est de même de la recrudescence des groupes terroristes dont le mode opératoire consiste aussi dans le recrutement des jeunes délaissés et exposés par des politiques sociales inadéquates dans beaucoup de nos pays. Dans cette même ordre d'idée, il convient d'examiner la pertinence de la Charte africaine de la démocratie, des élections et de la gouvernance sur les conflits armés et sur les conflits post-électoraux et notamment sur la question des déficits des cultures démocratiques, de gouvernance des droits humains, lorsque ces questions sont à la source de ces conflits. À cette question s'ajoute aussi la question de l'efficacité même des sanctions que nos instances prennent vis-à-vis des gouvernements défaillants lorsque on fait face aux changements anticonstitutionnels des régimes. Et dans ce contexte, la question qui nous a été posée, c'est quel est le rôle que le Parlement a joué dans la mise en œuvre de la Charte africaine dont nous célébrons aujourd'hui les 15 ans d'existence. Lorsque nous parcourons les annales de l'histoire du Parlement panafricain, il ressort que depuis 2009, le Parlement panafricain n'a ménagé aucun effort pour promouvoir non seulement la ratification de la Charte, mais aussi la mise en œuvre de cet outil de nature et de portée continentale. L'histoire se rappellera par exemple particulièrement de la campagne 11 for 2011 qui, en l'espèce de 2 ans, a permis en son temps de glaner 11 ratifications nécessaires ayant permis d'atteindre les 15 ratifications requises pour l'entrée en vigueur de la dite charte en 2012. Et en collaboration avec les organisations de la société civile et d'autres institutions de l'Union africaine, en son temps, le pape avait continué son plaidoyer qui a contribué significativement à l'augmentation du nombre de ratifications à près de 35 sur 55 États membres de l'Union africaine. Au-delà de la promotion de la ratification, le Parlement panafricain a aussi déployé ses attributions de promotion des principes des droits de l'homme, de la démocratie en Afrique et a encouragé la bonne gouvernance et la transparence et l'obligation de rendre compte dans les États membres pour sensibiliser leurs membres, pour sensibiliser les parlementaires des différents pays africains à l'adoption de lois intégrant les normes et les principes de la Charte africaine de la démocratie, des élections et de la gouvernance. Le pape a aussi contribué à renforcer les capacités des parlementaires pour exercer leur rôle de contrôle démocratique sur leurs gouvernements respectifs, encourageant ainsi l'adoption des mesures visant la mise en œuvre des normes et des principes qui sont édictés par cette charte. En plus de cela, la paix et la sécurité en Afrique, dont le lien avec la démocratie, la bonne gouvernance et les élections n'est plus à démontrer, ont constitué aussi des préoccupations constantes du Parlement panafricain. Et donc, plusieurs sessions du Parlement panafricain ont été consacrées à des situations sécuritaires dans les pays africains. Et cela a permis au pape d'examiner de manière quasi systématique, durant toutes ces sessions, des rapports du département de paix et de sécurité et d'adopter des résolutions dans ce sens. Et ces résolutions ont permis aussi de noter avec satisfaction le progrès réalisé par l'Union africaine dans la recherche de solutions pacifiques et efficaces aux turbulences auxquelles l'Afrique est confrontée en matière de prévention structurelle de conflits, de rétablissement et de maintien de la paix, ainsi que de la reconstruction post-conflit. Cela a permis de dénoncer aussi un certain recul observé et proposer des solutions pertinentes aux questions de paix, de démocratie et des élections. Dans les limites de ces moyens, le Parlement panafricain a aussi déployé à plusieurs reprises sa commission permanente de la coopération et des relations internationales et de prévention de conflits pour des missions de rétablissement ou de consolidation de la paix, en mettant un accent particulier sur le rôle plus accru des parlementaires en tant que représentants des peuples, l'implication de la société civile, en particulier les femmes, les jeunes, dans les efforts de leur pays à s'attaquer aux causes profondes des conflits d'une manière globale et de manière systématique, en prônant les valeurs démocratiques, le respect des droits de l'homme, la gouvernance au sein des populations africaines. Par ailleurs, il convient de noter que le Parlement panafricain a aussi, de manière systématique, sensibilisé les parlementaires et renforcé leurs capacités en vue de promouvoir et de contrôler la mise en œuvre au niveau national des recommandations formulées par certains organes de l'Union africaine comme le MAIEP, avec lequel nous travaillons souvent en parfaite collaboration, et qui, à chaque session, vient aussi présenter son rapport devant à la plénière du Parlement panafricain. Et donc, par ces recommandations, le pape a aussi encouragé les États, les chefs d'État et de gouvernement africains à œuvrer à restaurer la confiance des électeurs en respectant le suffrage exprimé par les populations et à considérer comme gouvernement anticonstitutionnel tout gouvernement qui se maintiendra au pouvoir en manipulant la Constitution ou en refusant le verdict des urnes. C'est dans cette même ordre d'idée que le pape a soutenu auprès de la conférence de l'Union africaine l'idée de formation d'un panel de chefs d'État africains qui a accepté de respecter les principes de l'alternance démocratique et à qui l'on confierait le règlement des différents pouvoirs survenir au sein des États dans le domaine de la démocratie et de l'organisation des élections. Il est un fait que le Parlement panafricain représente les peuples africains. Par conséquent, sa mission et ses activités ne peuvent avoir d'impact réel sans la participation et la prise en compte des aspirations de ce peuple. C'est ainsi que le Parlement panafricain a délibérément créé des passerelles pouvant faciliter l'accès des citoyens et de leurs organisations, notamment les organisations de la société civile, aux parlementaires ou aux commissions permanentes. Ces passerelles permettent à ces organisations et aux citoyens de saisir directement les parlementaires des questions touchant à la démocratie, aux élections, à la gouvernance et de soumettre aussi des motions et même des questions orales concernant des situations bien déterminées. C'est dans ce cadre-là que des organisations de la société civile, lors de nos consultations passées, ont contribué de manière significative au consensus sur le fait que le Parlement devrait avoir de plein pouvoir législatif, son plein pouvoir législatif et accéder à des ressources plus importantes pour lui permettre de mener efficacement sa mission. Il a également été demandé que les membres du Parlement tiennent leur gouvernement responsable de la mise en œuvre des décisions et des principes de l'Union africaine contenus dans divers instruments et en particulier dans la Charte africaine de la démocratie, des élections et de la gouvernance. En plus de cela, le Parlement panafricain a fait de son devoir de s'impliquer systématiquement d'impliquer systématiquement les organisations de la société civile dans les consultations qu'elles mènent dans nos différents pays sur des questions d'intérêt continental, notamment dans le cadre de formulation de lois types où les différents groupes sociaux, notamment les femmes, les jeunes, les personnes vivant avec handicap sont souvent associés et se sont vus donner l'opportunité de contribuer au débat. Et enfin, le mécanisme de pétition qui existe dans le règlement intérieur du Parlement panafricain permet aussi aux organisations de la société civile, aux citoyens, de le saisir afin que le Parlement puisse mettre en place les mécanismes pour encourager à la promotion de la démocratie, de la gouvernance et des droits humains. Il est regrettable cependant de noter que ce mécanisme de pétition n'est pas très connu du public et il revient aux organisations de la société civile de servir de passerelle pour la promotion de ce mécanisme afin que le Parlement soit plus utile par la saisine des citoyens. Voilà un peu ce que je voudrais dire à ce niveau. Et je voudrais conclure en disant aussi que l'Afrique est capable de relever le défi de l'instauration et de la consolidation d'une réelle démocratie et de gouvernance, même si de nos jours on fait face à des nouvelles menaces, à des crises de nouvelles formes, et le Parlement panafricain continuera toujours à déployer son mandat et à forger une collaboration fructueuse avec les différentes parties prenantes, notamment la société civile et les autres organes de l'Union africaine, pour mener cette mission de promotion et de consolidation de la paix. Et je vous remercie, Monsieur le Président de séance. Merci.
Thank you very much, Mr. Haru, for those very insightful remarks and ending on that very high note of asserting that, yes, indeed, we should be up to the challenge as a continent and as stakeholders with regards to addressing the challenges we are seeing in relation to democratic governance. Yes, the challenges exist, but we remain alive to them, and we do have the assets and the strength within us to be able to rise up and confront those challenges, and also particularly with regards to the Pan-African Parliament, acknowledging the very critical role that this organ plays in both spearheading the campaign for state compliance through leading campaigns on ratification for this instrument, and also facilitating the much needed avenues for citizen engagement by availing a space for effective collaboration and dialogue between civil society, the public, and parliamentarians who are organized within this continental platform, and also noting the success that some of that collaboration has also yielded by way of, the civil society forum associated with the Pan-African Parliament, actively speaking for a robust mandate for the Pan-African Parliament, and also calling for member states to equip the Pan-African Parliament with the necessary resources they would need to discharge that mandate, and also for calling for us to reflect very deeply on the underlying causes of some of the challenges that have led to the issues we're seeing around democratic governance, the underlying issues around what it means to try and implement the ACDEG in the context of armed conflict or post-conflict situations, and also in societies that have dealt with legacies of authoritarianism. So I thank you very much. I would now also take this opportunity to grant the floor to yet another very critical African Union organ that also plays the current role of chairing the African Governance Architecture Platform amongst the membership, and that is the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. And we are indeed privileged to have the Executive Secretary of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, Ms. Dindiwe Kumalo, with us. I do recognize that she may have a challenge with her video setting, but I do trust we will be able to hear her very clearly with regards to her audio. So I will now grant the floor to Ms. Kumalo, and yes, welcome. Just to confirm, Ms. Kumalo, I'm not sure if you are unmuted. We can't seem to hear you quite yet.
She seems to be unmuted at the moment. Maybe it's a matter of having the microphone on.
Ms. Kamalo, I'm not sure if you can hear us. Oh, she says she's speaking, but we can't seem to hear her. I'm not sure, maybe, could there be a challenge with the microphone? My apologies, maybe let's just try and take a minute to resolve this. Perhaps I could suggest that she disconnects and reconnects, and then exclusively uses audio only. Yes, I think we'll give her a brief minute to reconnect and hopefully join us. But I will also take the opportunity to remind us that we can also begin to provide some of our inputs via the chat function as we anticipate a brief panel soon after Ms. Kumalo's remarks. We can already begin to channel some questions or comments that we may have within the chat box. I will also encourage us to get on Twitter and share our thoughts via the hashtag #ChatterAfrica and DG Trends, where we can just provide some perspectives on some of the things we had. We can also highlight some ideas we have in terms of how we could address the unfolding challenges of unconstitutional changes in government, and also perhaps how we can advance the implementation of the ACDEG as we maybe even become bold and think of the next vision of what it would mean to have the ACDEG for the next 15 years. And perhaps we will then find a way of consolidating some of these thoughts and keep this conversation going. Martin, do we have Ms. Kumalo back on?
Yes, she's back on.
Great. If you could hear us, Ms. Kumalo, perhaps you could try and take the floor yet again. Great. I can see in the chat, she says she can hear everyone very well. Perhaps you could try and make an intervention so that we can see if we can hear you.
This doesn't seem to be working. Let me try to separately send to Mrs. Khumalo other options for joining within a phone or a different device. And I suggest Andrew maybe to keep the program going so that she can make her intervention a little bit later, if that's possible.
My apologies, Ms. Kumalo. So I will try and have Martin reach out to you bilaterally and try and resolve the connection issue, and then we can have you make your intervention as soon as you are able to. But in the meantime, perhaps I will try and move the program forward slightly by welcoming the insight of civil society, essentially, to reflect on the African Charter on Democracy, Elections and Governance and what it has meant to try and advance the agenda of its successful adoption and implementation. So Martin, I will leave the aspect of the connection to you. And so with regards to civil society, there has been a lot of work that civil society has done, as you've also heard from the prior speakers, in terms of collaborating with mandate holders, with policymakers to try and push the agenda of implementation. And it's in this framing that I would want to invite some of my colleagues to share some thoughts on what they think the future of democratic governance and in particular the implementation of this charter would look like. And to begin that conversation, I have two colleagues who I would say come from the research background of things, where they have done some considerable work reflecting on various themes of democratic governance, looking at aspects of member state compliance, and then also looking at citizens' perceptions around this critical area. And so the first speaker I will ask to take the floor is the Associate Director within the policy think tank ACDPM, Lidette Tadesse. And I will ask her to take the floor on the basis of a very broad question with regards to her experience and perspectives from the research field. What trends on democratic governance has she been picking up on the continent, and what does it mean for the future of this instrument? So the floor is yours, Lidette.
Thank you, Andrew. Good afternoon, everyone, and good to be here with you. Based off of Andrew's question, of course, there are several trends that could be discussed, but in light of time limitations, I'll maybe limit my intervention to three trends that I think are important. These are trends that, to some extent, have also been raised by the other speakers before me. So what I try to do is sort of draw a broad picture of what I think the state of governance in the continent is like, and what that means for the principles inscribed within the ACDEG. And I will maybe start with the fundamental, go from the fundamental to the more practical and tangible. So I think of the three topics or of the three trends that I would like to cover, I'll start with one around statehood and political stability, or the lack thereof in several African countries. We see that in a few countries, the statehood and political stability is under threat. And it is so due to mismanagement of identity or history, sometimes state resources, and also mismanagement of international relations, meaning due to globalization, but also geopolitical competition and interest in different parts of the continent. The actors that are important in political crises in various countries in the continent are not just neighbors, but also international actors from afar. So this concept of internationalization of conflict or internationalization of political crises, I think, is a trend we are witnessing. And I think all of these factors have also deepened political fractures within societies, within countries, and it has led many countries to focus on state security as the primary course of action, or for them to divert much of their state resources and political investment as well to securing state security. And to some extent, it has also meant that in order to do so, they have had to focus a lot more on the military. So in some cases, particularly in the Sahel case, in some of the Sahel countries, this has led to hyper-militarization, although mismanagement of these the military sector has also been a concern. So this in turn has led to a deprioritization of political and socio-economic governance in many countries, as states and governments are focused on maintaining state cohesion and maintaining sovereignty, so to say. In some countries, this trend has resulted in civil wars or wars, such as the case in Ethiopia. In other countries, it's the state losing part of its territory, such as Mali, for example. And in other countries, it's confrontations and military confrontations with terrorist movements, terrorist groups, such as in Nigeria. But the bottom line is the fact that various countries are undergoing a threat to their statehood, a threat to the existence of the state as we defined it, has diverted a lot of resources to security and less financial but also political investment to what we would consider political and socio-economic governance. The second aspect would be, and this relates to the point that I just spoke about, that at the continental level, I think it's fair to say that we have a lack of political leadership on governance. So the leaders that in the 1990s observed the various political crises that were going on in the continent, that had called for normative agreements and also legal agreements on unconstitutional change of government, but also made the point that as governments have a responsibility to their citizens. Accountability is part of that responsibility, and that political cohesion or resolving political issues and preventing political crises and maintaining stability being preconditions for economic growth. All of that normative mobilization and traction that we had seen in the late 90s, also giving rise to the ratification or the adoption of the ACDEG itself. A lot of that political leadership and sentiment seems to have died down. And that is also despite the fact that, for example, in the past 2 years, we have seen coup d'etats resurfacing in some countries, around 5 countries in the Sahel and also in East Africa, if we include Sudan. So this lack of political leadership, again, could be explained by what I mentioned earlier, that even the countries that are considered, the swing states in the continent, or those that have put in a lot of investment in Pan-African visions and in the role of the African Union as the overarching continental political actor in the continent, are sort of dealing with national issues and have not been able to deploy as much clout at the continental level, which sort of reinforced one of the fundamental gaps of the ACDEG and fundamental challenges of the African Union thereof, which is lack of enforcement capabilities. If the ACDEG's enforcement capabilities are largely tied to diplomacy, if they are tied to peer pressure, and if you don't have the leaders that would lend the AU and sort of invoke principles of the ACDEG to hold other states or other heads of states responsible and accountable, put in some pressure, then the ACDEG, questions around the value of the ACDEG as something that is more than a document, that is something as more than a document that is normative, then is limited. So here, to summarize, the lack of political leadership we have seen at the continental level, I think, has also further undermined the value of the ACDEG as something that is more than a normative document, and it has further reinforced the African Union's lack of enforcement capabilities. The third and final point that I would also say is a trend, and this has been mentioned by a few of the speakers before me, is, of course, the unconstitutional change of government. Now, not to sort of downplay the risks or the threat that we see in the resurfacing of unconstitutional change of government, but just to contextualize it, in the past 2 years, it's only 5 countries that have undergone unconstitutional change of government, or coups, the way we would define them. in a continent of 54 countries. However, the concentration of these coups in a region that is already fragile in terms of security, and be it human security or state security, is of concern. And if we were to broaden the definition of unconstitutional change of government to include constitutional manipulation or third termism, then the number of countries that have undergone that will have expanded. But if we, kept it to the definition of the ACDEG, which doesn't include constitutional manipulation as something that constitutes unconstitutional change of government, it's only 5 countries that, at least in the past 2 years, where we have seen coups. Now that said, I think unconstitutional change of government could be seen in 2 ways. One is in relation to breaches of the ACDEG, but also secondly, in relation to the questions and conceptual questions and normative questions that it brings to the ACDEG and the definitions of coups or definitions of unconstitutional change of government, the way the ACDEG defines it. And I'll just, mention some of these normative debates that have come to the fore because of some of the changes that or trends that we have seen in the past. Number one, this is, relates to what I just said a few minutes ago, which is if third termism is an issue, and if political crises in some of the countries in the continent are tied to constitutional manipulation, should the ACDEG expand its definition of unconstitutional change of government and include constitutional manipulation as something that constitutes a coup or unconstitutional change of government, basically. So this is, a legal and a normative question. The second one, and this is a bit more provocative, is what is the point, or what is the rationale behind a state that has failed, the civilian state nonetheless? But if the state has failed in its core functions, should we, blindly support a failed civilian government and, just be happy, not do anything about it, as long as it's a civilian state? So this is not to say that military governments should be celebrated if they have, if they are coming in the context of a failed state or in the context of a civilian state, a civilian government that has failed to do its duties. But it's important to take note, especially in the context of some of the cases in the Sahel, that the problem isn't just the military takeover, but also the failures of civilian governments that were in place and that had failed their citizens. This relates to a point that Alban also raised, and this is my third point, which is support to such military takeovers in some of the countries, particularly in Mali, for example, and what this means for the African Union, because it definitely puts it at the spot where, on the one hand, normatively, this is supposed to be unacceptable, but on the other hand, it seems like people had been so frustrated with the civilian government before the military takeover that they are willing to give the military a chance. So what do you do in such cases? Because the African Union can't, take a very hard stance on that. So again, this brings about a question around the norms of defining unconstitutional change of government, and then also enforcing some of the sanctions that the AU and its member states could apply in in times of coups. And the fourth point is the, again, internationalization of political crises, or the fact that political crises in many countries now increasingly involve not only neighbors, I think, that we've had before, but also international actors, transnational, transcontinental actors. And in such cases, what should be the role of the AU, and how does the African Union position itself vis-a-vis international actors, which oftentimes are, much more politically savvy and much more also politically prominent in these crises than the African Union has. So, with or without the vote of confidence that the African Union is able to get from its member states, how does the AU position itself to be a primary actor in preventing, but also managing political crises when they happen and acting on unconstitutional change of government in many countries in the continent. So these would be the three topics that I think, or three trends that I think are important and that I think confronts the ACDEG, but also broadly speaking, the governance agenda in Africa today. Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you very much, Lidet, for elucidating those three trends very clearly around internationalization of conflict, the question of political leadership, and how critical it is to enlivening the ACDEG from normative aspirations to tangible realities in the lived lives of the African citizenry, and then also reflecting more deeply on what it means to address unconstitutional changes of government and the element of constitutional manipulation as being an important consideration within an expanded definition of unconstitutional changes in government. Now, I recognize that we do have, time has moved on rather swiftly in the midst of very deep conversations, deep and rich conversations. So I am mindful of that. And one of the ways I would hope to mitigate this time factor and also to facilitate engagement is I would encourage any participants who may have questions from what they've had so far or may have inputs or comments to what they've had so far to even begin highlighting them within the chat box. My colleague Martin will try and track some of those comments so that we can then bring them out in a bit of an efficient way. I also know that we are expecting about 3 more presentations from civil society. And in one of those presentations, my colleague Justin has actually posted a link to what he'll be referring to in his remarks that we can already open on the side and begin to familiarize with. But then before I let my colleague, Mr. Nkomo from Afrobarometer come in, I think I noticed that Ms. Kumalo from the African Commission on Human and People's Rights may have rejoined. Am I correct in saying that?
Hello, Andrew. I am connected. Can you hear me?
Fantastic. We can hear you, Ms. Kumalo, and we are pleased that you've been able to endure with us with regards to the technical challenges and join us. So I will just quickly cede the floor to you to gain the valuable insights with regards to the African Commission on Human and People's Rights viewpoints and rules with regards to the question of the day. So the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, first for the invitation, but also for accommodating me. I'm not in Banjul as I speak, in a rather remote area in my hometown. So do forgive me for the video not being supported throughout this presentation. I'm delighted to join you today during this 15th anniversary of the adoption of the African Charter on Democracy, Elections and Governance, and to make a few remarks in support of the commemoration of the anniversary of this very important instrument. I would like to thank the leadership of the Charter Project Africa and all its partners for placing a spotlight on the transformational potentials of the ACDEG and for facilitating systematic engagements with civil society actors on issues of democracy, elections, and governance. These efforts are noble and consequential and represent an important contribution towards the improvement of the governance landscape in our continent. Distinguished guests and ladies and gentlemen, the nexus between respect for and protection of human and people's rights on the one hand and governance on the other in Africa cannot be overemphasized. One can find reference to the intersectionality between these two in the preambles of both the ACDEG and the African Charter on Human and People's Rights. It's clear that the forefathers of both instruments intended for governance and human rights to be kindred principles, kindred values that define our continent, our institutions, our values, and our practices. And this is why we at the African Commission on Human and People's Rights are pleased to be associated with the discussion of the theme chosen for this event, which is advancing Pan-African governance agenda and drawing lessons of 15 years of the African Charter on Democracy, Elections, and Governance. Ladies and gentlemen, democracy, free and fair elections, and good governance are not destinations, but an evolving journey of improvement and constantly adapting our systems and practices of governance. The success of this journey is a function of many contributing factors. One of these factors is the quality of the human rights environment in the continent. As we discuss this theme, this platform provides for all of us, AU organs, institutions with a governance mandate, institutions with a human rights mandate, civil society, and other actors, with an opportunity to take stock of the progress made and challenges encountered in the past 15 years to foster a culture of human rights and democratic governance in Africa. In Africa, the right of all peoples to enjoy equal participation in democratic processes and to be governed by a government of their choice was achieved after a lengthy and considerable period of struggle and suffering. Therefore, the triumph of democracy in Africa is one that is befitting an everlasting tribute to the men and women who paid the ultimate price for the freedoms that we enjoy. Within the Banjul Commission, we see the ACDEG as a reaffirmation of our values as African people, and also as an extension of the rights and freedoms contained in the African Charter on Human and People's Rights. It is in this vein that we are deeply committed to advocating for universal ratification, domestication, and regular reporting on the progress made and challenges encountered in the implementation of the ACDEG. In its engagement with state parties, the Banjul Commission has consistently reiterated the importance of the ACDEG, as we have similarly reinforced its importance, as well as the importance of other treaties and instruments to achieving our continental goals of an integrated, prosperous, and peaceful Africa, the Africa that we want. The Banjul Commission is currently the chairperson of the African Governance Architecture for a 2-year period, 2022 to 2023. In this capacity, the Banjul Commission is steering discussions amongst members of the platform on re-emerging challenges of unconstitutional changes of government in Africa. We do this
we seem to have lost Ms. Kumalo momentarily. Are you still there? Ms. Kumalo, are you still there? Can you hear us?
I'm afraid her sound, yeah.
Policy issues that are required to consolidate our democracy in Africa. I wish to encourage members of the AGA platform participating at this event to deploy the respective and diverse knowledge to put in place innovative, transversal approaches to assist the AU to continue to provide leadership on a Pan-African governance agenda. I wish every one of you present great engagements, and I thank you for listening. Thank you, Mr. Songa and colleagues.
Thank you very much, Ms. Khumalo, for still making time for us, despite your schedule and some of the technical challenges. We really welcome your remarks, and in particular, we welcome the invitation that you have extended to us from the African Commission's vantage point as the chair of the AGA platform to essentially provide or collaborate with regards to innovative approaches to advancing the agenda of democratic governance on the continent. And it's why I'm even more pleased to continue the discussion that we have just commenced in the panel with what Lidet has presented and what our other colleagues are about to present, because we're about to hear from some of the perspectives of civil society and how we can indeed put or bring to the table certain approaches or expertise that we have already been harnessing with regards to the work we've been doing at the national level, at the continental level, and hopefully it can lend itself to the broader objective of addressing the theme of unconstitutional changes of government, as has been clarified to be a priority for the AGA platform within the next 2 years. So I will try and get back to the conversation with my civil society colleagues after Lidet gave us those three trends on democratic governance on the continent. I would now also want to invite my colleague from Afrobarometer, Mr. Sibusido Nkomo, to also just give us a brief perspective on some of the trends they've been picking up on democratic governance, because Afrobarometer is in a very interesting vantage point with regards to a project that they're also implementing that has tapped into engaging different segments of the public, picking up different perceptions on key themes around democratic governance. And so I think their insight would also be valuable to this conversation. So Mr. Nkomo, the floor is yours. I would also encourage you to be able to summarize your key themes and trends so that we can be able to catch up with the program.
Thank you so much, Mr. Songa. Is my audio fine now? You can hear me clearly.
Yes, I believe we can hear you.
Okay.
Please proceed.
I'll stop my video just to spare the good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. So I'm Sibusido Nkomo, and I work for Afrobarometer, but I'm also here with a second hat, the civil society organizations and African governance platform project that is a sister to Charter Africa. And one of the 3 points I want to make around the theme today is that good governance and democracy go very much hand in hand, and they reinforce each other, or they might actually, if you have a lack of one, it will impact the other. The other issue that ACDEG needs to take into account is what happens with institutions at the national level, at the regional level, but also at the continental level itself. And lastly, it's about also politics and accountability. So what I will talk through now is just some data that we've collected from citizens across the continent, representing about 75% of the total population. And over the past 15 years, so I'll speak to over the 15-year period, but the point here is that support for democracy, popular support for democracy and democratic norms really matters to ordinary people. So one of the things that we found, for example, around democratic norms is that between 2011 and 2021...
my apologies, Mr. Nkomo. The sound has become a bit lower than I would have hoped. If you could speak a bit more closely into your microphone, I think we'll be able to hear you much clearer.
Is it better now?
If it could improve a bit more, I would greatly appreciate it.
I'm as close to my mic as I can possibly
That's
get.
actually good now. That's good now.
Oh, okay. All right. Okay, sure. Is everybody else fine with the sound? Yeah, okay. Okay, so I'll go ahead. I will also share these slides afterwards so people can also catch up. Sound. So in terms of support for democratic norms, one of the things we've noticed in 2011, 83% of Africans actually supported elections as the best way to choose leaders. But in 2021, it's at 75%. So there's a big drop that has happened over the past few years. In the same way, support for presidential term limits has actually increased, where you also have people are also now asking for accountability around presidents actually complying with court decisions, which is an increase from 67 to about 77% as well. There's also something that's been quite static is that support for parliamentary oversight of presidencies basically has been static at about 2/3. And then also when you look at support for multi-party competition, that's also been static at 63% over the 2011 to 2021 period. However, one of the key trends we're seeing is that the preference for accountable governance has gone up by 10 percentage points, so from 52% in 2011 to about 62% in 2021. So it's a mixed bag, but it's very clear that ordinary Africans actually want accountability from their institutions and also from their leaders. Another trend I'll talk about is looking at the supply of democratic institutions. So when I talk about supply, I mean what ordinary citizens actually perceive they're receiving from the people or the institutions that they have. So one of the factors is the free and fairness of elections. The other one is, does the president obey laws and courts? Does the president account to parliament? Do people actually perceive their countries to be democracies, and are they satisfied with democracy? I'll start with satisfaction. Satisfaction has actually dropped by 7 percentage points. It used to be 50%, now it's 43%. And I'll go back to my earlier point about good governance and democracy go hand in hand. And if people feel that there's a lack of accountability and elections may not be seen as free and fair, or in the case of countries where coups have taken place, and the reasons why, for example, ordinary citizens might actually support coups is because they realize that maybe the president or ministers and others are not actually being accountable to them and are not doing what they said they would do. So there's a big issue here about satisfaction with democracy. Another point I just want to highlight is trust in political parties. Political parties are big drivers of electioneering, but how elections take place. And one of the interesting things is that from 2011 to 2021, trust in opposition parties has been static at about 1/3 of citizens. Trust in ruling parties and governing parties has actually declined. It was nearly 50% in 2011, now it's declined to 43%. So there's something about what political parties are doing that is actually making citizens very unhappy. And the countries I'm talking about here don't include Burkina Faso, Eswatini, and Sudan, because in Eswatini, for example, political parties are not allowed to exist. So you can't talk about that there. And the second last point is about preference for democracy and rejection of authoritarian alternatives. And we've heard from previous speakers about what has happened in a couple of West African countries where the military has taken over. This area is a very consistent one where Africans reject one-man rule at about 8 out of 10. They reject one-party rule at 7 out of 10, and they reject military rule at about 75%. And it's always been consistent. It has never really moved much over the 10-year period. However, when you ask So before actually I talk about full demand for democracy, where you ask Africans about their preference for democracy over any other kind of governance compared to the one-man rule, one-party rule, military rule. That's also high. However, it's gone down a little bit from 73 to 69%. And when we take all of these 4 areas, we create an index on the full demand for democracy. And the full demand for democracy was actually higher in 2011 at 49% compared to 2021, 54%. So again, institutions, political parties, accountability, good governance, all talk to each other. And this is the work that the principles of ACDEG speak to all of these things. And some previous speakers also spoke about how does ACDEG and the AU to make sure that there's actually accountability over things that may not be going in the right direction. And I think we're already seeing trends showing that Africans are dissatisfied around a number of things regarding democratic governance. And just one last thing I'm going to just pull up is a look at SDG 16, which talks about peace, justice, and strong institutions. And we've been able to track this and to actually pull numbers together to show. Here's something.
I'm sorry, Mr. Nkomo, I'm going to ask that as you make your last point, please lean in even closer to the mic yet again.
Okay, sure. All right. Okay, so one of the indicators for SDG 16 we have is the reduced perceived corruption of police, judiciary, and parliament. And when we evaluate this over a 5-year period, we ask people, how many of the following people do you think are involved in corruption, or haven't you heard enough? So this is police, judiciary, and parliament. And across all the countries, most are red. People are saying they're doing worse. Only about 1, 2, 3, 4 countries, that is Tanzania, Nigeria, Morocco, and Ghana, were seen as doing better, with the rest in between sitting at a very static level. So my point is that all these things affect one another, and we cannot just look at them in isolation. And a document like ACDEG and institutions that are around it need to comprehensively relook at, can we actually make countries or institutions or politicians or leaders actually account? However, can't we also look at ordinary citizens to actually support this work, to actually force this accountability? I think that's a big factor that Ambassador Salah was pointing to earlier when he spoke, that we need to take into account what ordinary citizens can bring to the table around these issues and take these instruments to them, because if they don't know about them, there's not much that you can expect them to do besides being focused on a day-to-day issues and so on. But I thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Nkomo, and I think that is a very valuable work that Afrobarometer and its wider consortium under the CSO AGP project is doing. We would look forward to you sharing some of those findings that we can then circulate to the participants of this dialogue. But it's a very interesting reflection to look at a frame of analysis from 2011 to 2021 and realize that there are certain key themes that we can take with us in our thinking moving forward as to how to robustly implement the ACDEG for the next 15 years, for example. So thinking about the issues of pushing back on presidential term limits, thinking about the issues of speaking about rule of law issues like compliance with court orders by those in power, acknowledging the importance of political parties and the status of their internal democracy in facilitating democratic governance more broadly as being a key issue, and the fact that we should also pay attention to political parties as key players within the democratic governance space. And then, of course, dealing with the issue of accountability, political or otherwise, so that we then ask ourselves, not just as the African Union organs, but also as civil society and other stakeholders, what we can do within our respective mandates to push for greater transparency and accountability in the actions of political leadership, so that then it becomes responsive to some of the perceptions and concerns we have seen raised courtesy of those public surveys. So thank you very much, and we would be happy to facilitate disseminating those insights. I do have to concede that we will slightly spill over our original timeline, but I think it will be worth it in terms of our discussions, because we do have two other speakers who will provide very interesting perspectives that may answer some of the questions we had asked earlier in terms of what innovative approaches can we utilize or pick up on with regards to advancing civic engagement, in terms of advancing the implementation and support for the principles of the African Charter on democracy, elections, and governance. And to do this, I have two speakers. The first one I will quickly grant the floor to is the Executive Director of Code for Africa, Mr. Justin Arenstein, who will just give some quick perspectives with regards to some of the experiences they've had in terms of trying to innovate around civic engagement and democratic governance. So Justin, very quickly, the floor is yours.
Hi, apologies, just fumbling for unmute. I'm sure everyone appreciates that over the last 2 years. I'm also just trying to share my screen. We've had a lot of talking with very little kind of visual examples of potential approaches to tackling some of these issues that you've heard surfaced in the previous speakers. It looks like, Andrew, you're going to have to give kind of authorization on your side. I'm not certain if you can see how to do that.
You have presenter rights in theory at the moment.
Justin, I believe Martin was trying to clarify. Are you saying that Justin now has presenter privileges?
Yes, in theory, you should be able. You have presenters' rights as far as we can see. I can try to make you a co-host, even if that makes it even simpler.
How's it looking, Justin?
I think we have lost Justin.
Okay, then maybe as he'll need to set up the presentation, I might just invert the proceeding and instead grant the floor right now to the second speaker from the Kenyan organization Siasa Place that has driven dialogues with regards to youth participation in democratic governance processes. And we do, I believe, have Nerima Wako, who is the executive director of Siasa Place with us, and I will therefore grant her the floor at this time, and then Justin can follow soon after. So Nerima, if you can hear me, the floor is yours.
Yes, I can. Thank you, Andrew. I was actually hoping Justin would go before me, but I guess that's life. Good afternoon, and thank you for this invitation. I also don't have the best internet today, so I'm going to be in and out. Like I mentioned earlier, I am in the field, but just listening to my previous colleagues speak and all protocol observed, I think one of the only things that I would like to add, I'm going to be very brief, is
sorry, Nerima, just let me interject briefly and ask if you could speak a bit more loudly or closer into your microphone, please.
Okay, is this better?
Slightly. Could you try again, please?
Now? Yes.
Yes, I think I could hear you. Maybe just try and proceed, and let's see how we go.
Okay. So, as you mentioned in the introduction, I do work with youth, and some of the things that I'm seeing that are changing, I'm going to speak to some of the emerges that I'm witnessing for the future, and also talk to or speak to what are some of the things that I'm changing in the aspect of my work. So, when we talk about Africa and the population being young, we have to recognize, especially me being in Kenya, that only 5%, in fact, less than 5%, is over the age of 65. We like to quote that, over 70% of young people are in Africa. But then when we look at that statistic, we'll find that between the age of 15 to 24 is actually 59%. So it's a huge chunk of young people. And so that basically means that when Ambassador Salah spoke to how do we create, an awareness creation, even in the public itself, where we do not want this document to be shelved and we want ownership to be key, then we have to think, how are our children understanding this information? Because they're the ones who are going to have to own this, and they're the ones who are going to have to live this. So I have seen a rise in social media, as much as in rural areas, we would say people do not have access, or a large number does not have access. I have seen a hybrid system where, as we speak, and I'm sure you also see this yourselves in your work, there are WhatsApp groups that exist. There are Facebook groups that exist where you're able to have governors, senators, state representatives within those groups and community sharing feedback. But that means people who have access to smartphones. So what we've seen is a hybrid system where young people who have access to the smartphone are now translating or transmitting this information that occurs while they do that. So that's been something that's been really interesting in this space. But another thing that I am seeing is accountability, people using these platforms, and that touches on civic tech, which was mentioned earlier, where people are tracking budgets and highlighting particular issues and challenges and issues that are being highlighted to the point where they become mainstream media news. But the challenges that exist, I've already mentioned the inequality, but the gender dividend that exists. With COVID, there were already no or less women, especially young women online, and then COVID now increased that. But there's also the increase of misinformation, disinformation. In Kenya, as we're going into elections, we're seeing a lot of deep fakes already circulating. And so what does that mean in terms of democracy? When we talk about freedom of expression, not even going to go into the internet shutdowns that we witnessed during elections in some of our countries. But I know those conversations about rejuvenating democracy, where young people are losing faith in the system. They're losing faith in state bodies that are supposed to be independent and counting these votes. So there's an apathetic stance and people questioning whether democracy is really a system that works, especially for African youth, or if it's something that works for us. So we find a lot of youth asking us these questions of, do I really have to participate? Do I need to participate? But civil society is also changing. There are emerging groups, and they no longer look like the typical civil society, which is a registered institution or an organization. They're movements or people working around hashtags and youth working around particular issues, and not necessarily forming a formalized organization to do that. And so are we willing to work with these entities as they continue to morph, especially when we talk about a population that is not really interested in bureaucratic processes? They want responses that are quick. They want feedback that is fast. And so what I do see is the tracking of government funding and expenditure in terms of accountability now moving toward online and platforms of people sort of watching these sort of things happening and organizing around that. But I also see intentional intergenerational alliances where when we have a young majority population, we have to rethink what we think about youth. In the aspect of even ageism, where culturally young people are not really supposed to be at the table and making certain decisions, but now because of the shift in population and them being the bulge, they have to be at the forefront of some of these negotiations and some of the solutions. They're the ones who are going to have to come up with it. So the spaces that, you know, permit them to be able to speak freely and to be able to organize and to be able to be at the platform is going to be important. Another thing that I see is the involvement of the private sector, where because I'm talking about a majority population being young, something that's going to be on the table of our discussions is going to be the environment or climate and food security. So agriculture is going to have to come to the fore, especially as we talk about the high cost of living or the high cost of food production. And we talk about climate change affecting how our seasons are and hunger and drought being at the forefront. So youth or young people are going to care a lot more about food and where they're getting their food, which means we have to change how we view agriculture and it being an opportunity rather. And that's why we're going to see a lot of private sector needing to be encouraged, or at least given the environment to be able to prosper, because what we see in Africa is government sort of taking over this role, and agriculture belongs to the government and food production belongs to the government, but they might not, or they'll probably not be able to handle that in the long run. So those are just some of my feedback from this. Thanks, Andrew.
Thank you very much, Nerima, and very, very insightful in introducing a very key element for us to think about, that if we are going to effectively speak about awareness and citizenship engagement and ownership of the principles of the African Charter on Democracy, Elections, and Governance, it means being very alive to and tangibly aware of the demographics we are dealing with and the issues that the broadest or the heartbeat of society is dealing with. And so when we talk about youth and their role with regards to the future of our continent and the important role they play, we must therefore tailor our strategies of engagement. We must also elevate the elements of public participation to ensure that they are effectively represented, that they are actual decision makers, and that even the engagements we have are responsive to the way they organize, to the way they articulate the issues, and also to the way they prioritize the issues. And so very pleased to also note some of the things you've highlighted about the potentials of civic technology in enhancing accountability, but also the pitfalls that may exist. We are in the digital information age, but we are also equally in the digital misinformation age. And maybe that's a good stage to introduce the next speaker, Justin. Because Code for Africa is heavily invested in some of these innovative approaches and have insights as to the benefits and pitfalls of what it means to embrace these approaches. So I will quickly grant Justin the floor, and I can see, I think he has managed to share his screen. Justin, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you. And that was, as you were saying, the perfect segue into what I'm hoping to share with you. So I'm from an organization called Code for Africa. I am originally an anti-corruption data journalist, but for the last 10 years, I've been working in the technology sector, specifically around accountability technologies, but also around civic engagement technologies. And the organization I'm with works across 21 African countries at the moment, all the ones in dark blue on that map. And then we also substantively fund or support partners in the light blue ones on the map. So our insights are a fairly good cross-section of the very different environments that you find across Africa. And the develop and the kind of the insights that we've kind of gained over the last 10 or 11 years that we've worked on this in this field have been driven by local expertise. When we talk about technologists or about data or about digital activists, it's not people parachuting in. Our staff are all locally based and our partners are all local grassroots organizations. We try and bring together a set of different tools, the kinds of tools that people in government and people in the traditional human rights defending kind of civil society organizations don't always have access to. So everything from what we call robot helpers, artificial intelligence, machine learning, natural language processing type tools, bots, which is probably what the ordinary person would call them, through to hardcore data science. And here I mean data scientists who treat data as an incredibly complex, kind of very granular tool to understand the world around them. And then also we work with forensic researchers and investigators. We work with people in laboratories and who create the evidence in the data where there isn't any. So everything from capturing air samples through to measuring kind of phenomena or kind of problems that normal people face. And all of this we try and bring together to create solutions-focused interventions, whether it's information or whether it's a toolkit. We do that in ways that, as you've heard previous speakers suggest, we do that in ways that tries to bridge this gap between the online world and an offline world. So we use everything from guerrilla wall art, as you can see in this picture, through to WhatsApp and dark social kind of messaging, but then driven on the back end by more complex AI-driven machine or kind of information systems. The reality, though, is that when we talk about our governments, even in the richest countries on the continent, South Africa, Kenya, Nigeria, this is what data looks like. This is literally a photograph of a records kind of archive from the Kenyan government of land records. So everything from who owns land to what kind of mineral rights are available to kind of who can use and draw water to irrigate their crops. This is how that information is managed in the governments that we all work in. And our job is often transforming this kind of information into something that you can access on SMS or on a smart app on a smartphone. We also very often, we try very hard to elevate women's voices in this, because often the world, the data, everything around them is designed for a male perspective. And even the way that we measure data or the way that we measure buildings and build the rooms that we're in or set the air temperature on our air conditioners is governed by male preferences. So we've taken a very strong feminist approach to both the technologies and the data that we build. And we also try and amplify communities. So we try and inject these solutions into communities themselves. And we do that through funding and through partnerships and through bringing to bear expert analysis, because often the data and the information that you're looking at you don't see the bigger trends in it because you're too close to the topic and you need to take a step back. So we provide the experts that are able to do that. We try and use this technology and data to do two big things, and this is common across almost all civic technology interventions. We try and decrypt or decipher very complex information. So we try and explain complex processes, whether it's governance or rules or policy making, and we try and simplify that in a way that every man or every woman can understand. And then the second most important part is, rather than just lecturing people and telling them stuff, we try and give them a route to action. We try and give them actionable information that they can use to make decisions. And this point is the crux of where many digital activists or digital government initiatives fall flat. They think that technology and social media and dark social and data and the rest of it are simply a more effective megaphone to get your message across more loudly, rather than understanding that actually the revolution of the internet and of technologies in our world, digital technologies, is that they give us tools to do things in faster and more efficient ways, not just to receive information, but to take an action. And so what we try and do here is build stuff that gives people actions. We try and do that by focusing on the things that really matter to people. And this is the second failing of much of e-government, is that the strategists don't always consider what really matters to normal people. What keeps them awake at night and gives them night terrors? It's usually stuff about their children's livelihoods. Can they keep their families healthy? Can they get enough clean water and kind of nutritious food? And only then do all the other kind of luxuries, such as democracy, kick in as a priority. And so what we try and do is use the lens of bread and butter issues to figure out what are the entry issues that we need to help people tackle and solve through a democratic lens or through a governance lens that allows them to lever governments and democratic processes to address the real needs in their lives. I'm going to give you some just very quick examples. So land is a major burning point in Africa. Who owns it? Where is my boundary? What can I do with it in terms of licensing? Who can come and mine the land under my land? Who can do stuff above my land? All of that kind of thing is a burning issue. It plays out slightly differently in different countries. And the key issue here is information and access to real, actionable, up-to-date information. So we work with communities across the continent and empower them with very cheap technologies. That picture of that quite ominous-looking drone that you can see in the bottom there is relatively expensive. It's a couple of $1,000s. But using that, we're able to map entire communities that were previously invisible to planners or to corporates who try and kind of profiteer off their access and control of tangible land. So I'm not going to play this video because we don't have time, but the link is on the presentation. If you click it, you'll see how we supported a small group of women entrepreneurs in a community called Makoko in Nigeria to use some drones to map themselves. And now the trick is to map their community, which previously was in that first picture where you'll see it's just gray on Google Maps. And within 2 weeks, the tweet says 1 week, but it actually took 2 weeks. You can see the level of mapped detail right down to individual buildings that had been mapped incredibly accurately using a combination of drones and satellite imagery. And then how that community used this information to intervene with government planners, with aid agencies, and with corporates to try to convince them to put the infrastructure that they needed in place, but also just to understand that there were people here. 300,000 people lived in what was previously a blank spot on a map. Secondly, just as another completely different example of actionable information, is our Sensor Africa program, where we equip communities with very cheap hardware sensors that measure air quality, sound volumes, temperature, in some cases radiation levels, and various other factors that we can measure. Turns that into data almost like a live ticker and allows communities to use that information to fight either legal battles or policy battles that previously would have been impossible. This is an example from a Kenyan community that used air quality sensors to close down a factory that was doing massive environmental and health damage to their community that they'd been unable to tackle, even with political support from local politicians for the past 10 years. Within 3 weeks of collecting data evidence, they were able to go to various courts and have the factory first suspended and then closed down when they failed to introduce remedial measures. In addition to that, some of the tools that you will be more familiar with are things like tracking political promises and using crowdsourcing and other tools and building open source versions of this so that not just an NGO can use it, but that community groups can deploy these things right down at school committee level. We have communities who are using this to track their school committees, as just one example. Secondly, easy ways to create petitions and ensure that they get automatically not just sent to a politician, but that there's a follow-up tracking mechanism. Because one of the other big failings of civic technology and digital activism is that it's very good for making a noise and for shining an initial spotlight and saying, this thing is broken, but it's very bad at actually creating a solution, because alerting someone that a light bulb is broken or that there's a pothole on a road doesn't mean that there are the resources within an agency to fix the problem that you shined a spotlight on. And so one of the things we try and do is connect people not just to the authorities, but also to other enabling partners who are able to bring the resources to focus on creating a solution, which often means supporting the government agency that needs to do the solution. Some of the other things you've already heard other speakers mention, we help people understand their local budgets better and what those budget plans are. We help people understand why taxes are important, because basically your time and the slave labor that you do to earn money is translated into tax funding that a government then turns into activities. And so we have found a way of translating just your taxes into how much time you are working for that politician's new car or for a new bridge or a new hospital, and do you think it's actually worth the time? We help fight the information war, which you've heard other speakers talk about. There's a growing dissatisfaction with the democratic processes because there is growing distrust in the credibility and the intention of governments. And we've given people tools to tackle that.
Sorry to interject, but I would have to encourage you to wrap up on account of time.
Cool. So there are a lot of different tools tackling exactly those issues: healthcare, environmental concerns, foreign entities diving in and stealing your minerals. All of this is possible even in data and technology and access challenged countries like Niger or the Central African Republic, which are undergoing, or Mali, which are undergoing coups or insurgencies, and it's difficult to operate. Citizen data coupled with commitment from transnational or continental organizations like the AU can change that phenomena. We don't have time to speak about the information war that's happening that is subverting these democratic processes, including how there's been the development of an entire shadow economy of entrepreneurs who are paid by candidates, parties, and even criminal cabals to subvert our democracies, our elections, and our parliaments through fake information on the internet. And there are a litany of examples in the slides. You can click on the links that show you how this is playing out. And there are countermeasures that civil society, that the AU and other civic watchdogs can deploy if they're aware of them. And then anyhow, some of them are kind of existing networks rather than creating new networks. We should be reinforcing the existing expertise that has been brought to the table, and should not be wasting money on launching yet more initiatives. We should rather be pumping resources into proven initiatives, because people at the end of the day are the real solution here. Data and technology are just an enabling factor. With that, back to you, Andrew. Everything that I've shown is open source, so you're welcome to steal it. Please do. And if you need help redeploying it, we're here to do that.
Thank you very much, Justin. And I'm glad that the presentation is widely accessible and people can continue to interact and explore those very valuable examples of what it means to harness civic technology and make it actionable in the space of realizing our broad objectives of enhancing citizen engagement and enhancing transparency and accountability in the arena of governance. So we've had a lot of input, and I do agree we have spilled over time quite significantly, but I think it's all in a very good endeavor. And so I would open up for some perspectives that any people on the any perspectives from participants or speakers may have to respond to some of the things they've had. I think to kickstart it, I was looking at the chat box and I did notice a comment from Tunde Aremu in Nigeria. I hope he's still with us, and he's, I think, was responding to the presentation we had from Mr. Nkomo with regards to some of the perceptions they've been documenting from 2011 to 2021. And he says he's curious as to how you could say Nigeria is doing better in the view of shrinking space, I believe shrinking civic space. And he asks how much of the findings that indicate that the country is doing well are linked to the realities of the average person on the streets and the perception of realities by the young of the country who constitute the larger part of the populace. So it's basically trying to explore what informs some of the perception surveys, perhaps how they're undertaken and how we make sure that they are indeed reflective or a wider depiction of what the public actually do feel around these themes of democratic governance. So Nkomo, if you're still with us, maybe you could have a brief response to what Aremu from Nigeria has asked. Is Nkomo with us? I'm not sure if we still have Nkomo with us, but I think it's an important factor to note that as we also engage with the public, as we try and harness public views on this very critical themes around democratic governance, I think one of the underlying aspects, and I think also Justin kind of intimated it in terms of how they engage with regards to harnessing actionable information, we need to be alive to how we rope in public insights and the parameters we put in place to make sure that the research we undertake is indeed inclusive, consultative, and participatory enough to give us a very clearer picture on the trends that we hope to document with regards to democratic governance. With that, I will still encourage if anybody else had any comments or issues to raise. We have a raise hand function that we can utilize. Maybe we can take in 2-3 comments if they're there. If I see no hands or comments, I will proceed to the next stage of just trying to conclude with some remarks and essentially release us all, which I think I will now do. And of course, I will begin first on behalf of the Charter Project Africa. I will begin by thanking all our participants who availed themselves for this very valuable conversation. And I will also extend my gratitude and appreciation to all the speakers who joined in our panel or who provided the remarks that anchored our discussion. My appreciation goes out to the head of the AGA Secretariat, Ambassador Salah Hamad. It also goes out to our colleagues from the African Peer Review Mechanism, from the clerk of the Pan-African Parliament, Mr. Haru. We greatly appreciated your remarks, and as well as Ms. Lindiwe Kumalo, the Executive Secretary from the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. We greatly appreciate the time you accorded to us and granted us the opportunity to gain insights on where youth as institutions feel the state of governance is on the continent and what the future holds for the implementation of the African Charter on Democracy, Elections and Governance. I extend my appreciation to the panelists from my civil society counterparts, Lidet, Thank you very much for highlighting those trends that we should be tracking, Mr. Nkomo, for sharing the insights on the trends that you've been able to document and continue to document as Afrobarometer, and Nerima for really putting into perspective what it means to reflect on youth participation, and also Justin for opening our eyes to the boundless possibilities, but also challenges that may come with embracing civic technology. And so I will just try and highlight some key takeaways that I think we can carry with us as we think of furthering this conversation and this dialogue about actioning around the implementation of the African Charter on Democracy, Elections, and Governance, and for the next 15 years and beyond. I think from the conversations we've had, we can confidently say that the ACDEG remains an important instrument in the furtherance of Africa's sustainable development. That a lot of work, however, remains, despite the progress we've made. As had been highlighted previously, we've had some major steps taken with regards to ratification, 35 member states ratifying the instruments. We've had some milestones along the way in terms of improving governance, rule of law, and the protection of human rights on the continent. But despite this levels of progress and milestones, a lot of work does remain to enliven the principles of this instrument into tangible progress in the lived realities of the people. And for that, we need to continue engaging in a multi-stakeholder effort that enlivens the instrument and makes it relevant to our current challenges, which again were eloquently highlighted: internationalized conflict, political leadership questions, and constitutional changes of government. We need a multi-stakeholder effort to make the ACDEG relevant to these current challenges. The good news, I think, is that there is an existing infrastructure for multi-stakeholder engagement that we can build on, and also collaboration. We have the African Governance Architecture platform, and from the conversations and the remarks we've had, we can already see that there is work ongoing and there's potential to maximize on that work with regards to synergies amongst the African Union organs, synergies with member states, and also expanding the potential for citizen engagement at the norm-making level at that continental platform, and then also cascading it back to the national levels. But then also it provides platforms for accountability based on how that citizenship engagement is facilitated. We had that in the examples that were raised with regards to the Pan-African Parliament, the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, and even the African Peer Review Mechanism by way of the State of Governance report. There are also civil society efforts that we have now had that are trying to harness public awareness, provide valuable evidence-based advocacy, and inform policy processes at the continental and national level, and also to promote accountability by providing actionable information that the citizenry can use to ask questions of their political leadership. And that finally there is room to embrace innovation in this multi-stakeholder effort in the form of civic technology, as we have just had, and we've seen what civil technology can do with regards to building actionable information, but that we need to mitigate the risks and challenges that are also within that environment. We've had a lot about the issues of misinformation. And so on that basis, I think one of the other key takeaways that we can carry with us is, if we have an existing infrastructure that we can build on, if we acknowledge that the ACDEG instrument does have relevance, but it needs to be enlivened to the current challenges, how can we then promote more strategic coherence between all these existing efforts of different stakeholders to ensure that the aggregate of our efforts will be an improvement in the key metrics of democracy, governance, and rule of law, so that maybe when we look at the February 2023 report, we will be looking at our consolidated efforts yielding some dividends at country level and changing some of the trends, concerning trends that Mr. Nkomo had raised with regards to the eroding faith in public governance systems. With that, I thank you all for your participation. We will try and summarize some of these key highlights into a guide note. We will work to make the presentations available. As we had noted, the recording of this virtual event had been done, and I believe we will then find a way of then sending or providing the link for the recording of this conversation to all those who would be interested. Perhaps I think I'll yield the floor to Martin briefly before we close to highlight maybe how that can be done. I don't know whether it will be a link that ACDPM will popularize and highlight, or if a mailing list based on the registered participants can be generated to send some of this material, but we will definitely find a way of publicizing the materials associated with this event so that the dialogue can continue. So maybe I'll just give Martin 1 quick minute to give an indication of what would be possible, and then I can release us all.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you, everyone. It certainly doesn't require a full minute. Just to say, indeed, we will email participants and esteemed speakers with the follow-up material. I'm not sure exactly in which shape it will take, because it's quite a long video to send unedited. But at the very least, a comprehensive report on what has been said here, as well as the slideshow that has been presented. I also invite you just to have a look at the Twitter activity and little bites from the conversation that have been shared and are getting discussed on Twitter at the moment. Over.
Great. Thank you, Martin. And so with that, on behalf of the Charter Project Africa Consortium members, that is ACDPM, that is the European Partnership for Democracy, Africtivists, Gore Institute, Democracy Works Foundation, I would like to then, and Code for Africa, of course, I would like to thank you all for your participation. And stay posted. We have our social media handles, Charter Project Africa. We will be highlighting future engagements. We do have some resource materials that may be of interest to you, such as a primer to unpack the African Charter on Democracy, Elections and Governance that was prepared by ACDPM. We do have a massive online course that is in the process of being unveiled with registration ongoing, that is being coordinated by Africtivists. And we do have some calls that are seeking to tap into the work of civil society and the use of civic technology by way of the Charter Projects Africa's Civic Tech Fund that we are also in the process of rolling out. So subscribe to the Charter Africa newsletter, join our social media handles, and keep track of the news. And hopefully we will be able to keep you posted and drive more of these conversations as we move forward. Thank you once again, and do enjoy the rest of your day, afternoon, good evening, depending on your time zone. And from me in Nairobi, it is Kwaheri and Asante Sana.
Thank you so much, and goodbye, Andrew. Goodbye, everyone.
Merci. Merci.